UNESCO, sorry, it's Chair for Translation Studies and Intercultural Communication. Apologies for the length of the name.
Yes, but it is from Krakow, Jagiellonian University from Krakow, so everybody will understand. And I do not want to extend my presentation of the speakers because I think we can use the time for your talk.
Thank you very much. If I may ask,
yes.
Okay, I may say.
Yes.
If
to distribute.
You were so kind as to
yes.
distribute.
And one per person or two?
Two pages from each file. To just explain, the old-fashioned traditional handouts are just reference to save your time because the materials on the handouts come from the website of a project that I'm going to talk about. So that's, at some point I will refer to them, but it's not the script of the presentation. So to begin, let me express my great gratitude to the organizers of the conference for the kind invitation and the pleasure to be able to be here and attend. I will be talking about efficacy of translator education towards professional goals and neglected placement area, and this overambitious title really boils down to one observation, and I suppose somewhat confirmed by the attendance. Placement as a notion is a Cinderella in translation pedagogy. I mean, who cares and why should we bother researching or investigating or even commenting on student translation work placement? Because that's the potential I'm going to explore. The rough scheme of the ideas that I will try to refer to briefly, of course very briefly, is translator training programs and curricula, pedagogy versus TS research into competence models, Kirali's postulate of bringing authenticity into the curriculum, EGPS and implications for optimizing translation student work placement, then placement and modern academia, and logically I will conclude with some final reflection if I manage to, time-wise. So the pedagogical perspective is, of course, one based on Kirali's, I call it for short, new pedagogy. So recent ideas proposed by Donald Kirali in his translator competence models. And the research assumption that I put forward is that translation student placement fills in the gap between industry and academia. But what the actual didactic potential of placements is, we will try to explore in, subsequently. Research objectives, as specified, is to use a proper epistemological background to translation pedagogy that would be adequate for translator education, and I put a claim that some of the existing epistemological background tenets are no longer valid. Then I will briefly refer to competence models and research into competence models, so hence the objective to demonstrate how placement is localized in competence models, existing popular, widespread, seminal competence models, and then to analyze the EGPS project and Kirali's emergence perspective as a viable proposal to incorporate the placement component into curriculum. And of course to confront the research approach with the actual translator training scene, and we will make a certain loop. So starting with how it is now, in general in translator education from the perspective of the actual educational setting, so the translation classroom and curriculum. I put a claim that in fact, if you think hard about it, we don't really have any methodologies as of today to analyze the relevance, purposefulness, and efficacy of translator education towards increasing the level of professionalization. There is a huge number of all kinds of studies, pedagogical, didactic, etc., but I'm not familiar with any that actually check how certain didactic and pedagogical educational assumptions implemented in teaching bring out concrete specified results. So this balance between industry and academia that is so visible in education of translators, and we've had a number of various events, publications on the topic of professionalization in translator education. It's really one of the buzzwords in translation pedagogy today, although I think we're already moving ahead and in a slightly different direction. So the inquiry focuses, as I said, on translator training programs and competence models. And let's briefly refer to the state of affairs as concerns programs and curricula. The stereotypical observation about those is that there is a certain rigidity and inertia of academic systems of education, and that's embedded in the very nature of university, how it functions, and a huge system such as a university inevitably is characterized by inertia of its formal, administrative, technical, etc. Characteristics. And that is in a very strict contrast to what happens dynamically and at a very fast pace in translation industry. So the specifics of translation studies as a discipline within academia and the business of translation, this kind of correlation and also clash, is something that I would say other disciplines are not so strongly marked by. Other humanistic disciplines, philological disciplines. In case of translation studies, it's very, very strong because well, all the technology, that's one point, and implications of technology implementation in academic system. So institutional impediments of all kinds, like down-to-earth difficulties in IT with technology, with formal restrictions connected with the academic status of TS and other, and of course I use the abbreviation TT for translator training, as if the more practical didactic reference, and TS, of course, for translation studies. The fact that curricula are compartmentalized, and they are in response to competence models that we are familiar with, as if such a perfect alignment existed, as if, let's say, modules aligned with competences, and the example here is intercultural pragmatics module, is perfectly aligned with acquisition of intercultural competence. That's as if assumed, but I don't quite 100% believe in such a perfect alignment. A lot of other factors are at stake. Also, a linear and modular course design, plus the very framework of curriculum. So the fact that certain courses are obligatory, certain are optional or semi-elective, and that leads to arbitrary selection of teaching material by students in some teaching frameworks. And of course there is a lot of differences and diversity among educational systems, not only in Poland, also more widely globally. And also increasing specialization in response to market changes, which is like a slogan and motto nowadays, because when we are talking fit for the market, what kind of market is it about? So is academia able to catch up with changing employment needs? We are successful to some extent in some respects, in some institutions, but I suppose there is still room for improvement here. Okay, so this static or linear approach, copyright, embedded copyright, it's my classroom and students agreed. So models focus on skills acquired, and that's important, not on the process of acquisition. So we focus less on as if skills were ready products, and we have been, I would say, less interested in the process of acquisition. A static linear approach, like we are having here, so very disseminationist, difficult words today. I'm speaking and everybody is listening, or at least makes an appearance. Thank you very much for your kind appearance. Is no longer the case in our translation classrooms, in many of our translation classrooms, although we do have obligatory component of Introduction to Translation Studies as a lecture, which is usually conducted in a very traditional format. So a lot happens here as well. And when we try to link pedagogical assumptions with competence framework available, and competence models available, of course the reference needs to be made to EMT model and Kelly in cooperation, 2003, PACTA group model, 2000 ongoing, their main publications were written in between the decades, 2000, 2012 more or less, but they are continuing now, and there are some new ideas for competence research in this year and next year. Güpferich's model, Transcom 2009, Kirali 2000, which is dramatically different from his contemporary models. And apologies for really glimpses, because we are all familiar with the models. So I'm just going to refer to the diagrams to indicate that potentially in the models there is room for placement as a skill acquisition and skill training component in translator education, but it's only implicit, like translation service provision, of course, info mining, technological, thematic, in all of those sub-skills, there is room for placement as a stage in the translator's development. Same for PACTA, strategic subcompetence, potentially of assistance, instrumental, knowledge about translation subcompetence, bilingual subcompetence, extra-linguistic, in all of those subcompetences, there are links with placement, although it is not present explicitly, the component of placement. And Güpferich's Transcom model as well. So apologies for these just really mere glimpses. And 2000 model of teaching proposed by Kirali, that is competence, transferable competences model. And it has an element of active indication of some dynamic possibilities, although on the surface of it, it's still static, in spite of those indications. And then, what happens now is obnoxiously fractal, new Kirali's idea. And by new, I'm referring to 2014 publication and subsequent articles and the book of 2016 written by Kirali and colleagues. The metaphor that Kirali uses of Romanesque cauliflower is in line with contemporary inquiries into complexity theory by translation pedagogues. Yes, I skipped one screen with as if summary of those typical existing until the end of the 20th century TC models. In contrast to those positivist reductionist epistemologically, which have been in some ways borrowed from social sciences and education, which is so typical for translation studies pedagogy. Competence, and it's not a negative remark, competence-based, it's enrichment. Competence-based learning, so strictly as if structural. specification of particular sub-competences, and container-like metaphor suggesting that skills are discrete products. Okay, so that's what we have. And Kirali's Romanesque cauliflower. I was so anxious to show it that I moved the sequence. So in this Kirali's new approach, post-constructivist, because we're really talking now about emergentist pedagogy, so, and we have some specialists in the room here on that as well. A break with disseminationist approaches, a move from linearity to dynamic complexity, and proposed by Kirali, epistemologically of emergence. And what is that? Intricate complexity in place of compartmentalization and reductionism, alternative non-reductionist view of translator competence. And here a disagreement begins, because alternative non-reductionist view of translator competence may really lead to chaos. And we've experienced that in our discussions on the EGPS. So Kirali's proposal, I'm copying a model just for reference from the article 2014 that is on the website of the EGPS project, available in open access, and the website will appear on the next slide. So translator competences that Dr. Marczak is going to talk about as well, emergent ideas. That's a vortex, it's a twirl, it's a motion, dynamic, unpredictable, with all the positive but also negative implications. And that's how Kirali views emergent learning in institutional settings. And it is a result of some thoughts given to the idea of placement within the European graduate placement scheme. And we quarreled about the tooth properties in the image. We were rather negative about this visualization, but still that's how it functions. So Kirali's postulate of bringing authenticity into the curriculum is that an emergentist vision that is in tune with state-of-the-art thinking of the nature of learning in our postmodern era. And that's the response that translation pedagogy needs. Transition from a fractured competence perspective to a fractal one. Okay, I'm sorry for the slides that I'm skipping, because we have to move on to emergence of workplace competence. Sorry, here. In 2014, Kirali's model, placement marked in yellow here, or internship in American terminology, in a model of didactic sequencing, is a prominent, highlighted stage in professional growth of translators. So it's not only a stage that a translator goes through in his or her education, it's also a component in the curriculum. So this, each individual project builds the translator's competence in a number of, as he pictured them, twirls or vortexes that in some way resembles a group of cauliflowers, if we want to keep this metaphor. So the project that was funded by Erasmus and took place in the years 2012 and 2015, and the handouts are about it, centered on student placement in international cooperation. So the whole idea of the project was to analyze how potentially student work placements can be useful in translator education. And that's the website. To enhance European cooperation between enterprises and higher education institutions, to stimulate and facilitate the international mobility, to increase employability, and to build on existing collaborative ventures between employers, higher educational institutions, and related translator education projects, and to contribute to curriculum development. So Kirali's models are, and it's really fascinating because I have it in my own personal history, all those discussions on how the models came into being, they are absolutely Kirali's ideas, but during the project meetings, we had a chance to you know, exchange opinions and analyze how it works, what's our opinion, etc. And what is interesting from the perspective of efficacy of placement in translator education, the project created a database of certain standards and documents that are meant to organize the process of placement. So, placement agreement, which is a formal requirement, obviously, student questionnaire, mentor's report, student portfolio, and reflective journal. And the last component is maybe of some interest. The second handout concerns that particular aspect, with some comments from authentic portfolios. And because we have really no time to continue, I would like, to dig deeper into the issue, and that's not the idea of a short conference presentation. Let me emphasize that the key notion in the learning process of the reflective journal and portfolio, and I hope we are familiar with the terms, in the context of placement is self-reflection. So coming back to reality, we have the models, we have some placement potential, and now what do we have in reality, and what is it in our at least Polish placement teaching experience? So what about placement in modern academia? It is obligatory in some programs, not in all programs, not universally. Like at the School for Translators at Mainz, its work placement is an elective course only. There is a time requirement, so there is a specified number of hours, timing is flexible, and there are a set of formalities, contracts, etc. that needs to be signed. The number of points is given, ECTS points in Poland. There is a higher educational institution placement coordinator and a placement provider, of course, who gives the placement opportunity. And perhaps there may be ocena studenta przez pracodawcę in the Polish context, and that's about it. That's about it. And in many institutions, it would be exciting to hear your views or from your experience in the institution, whether student placement has any follow-up, if there is any reflective exchange of critical analysis of the process of skill acquisition on the basis of such documents, for example, that are proposed by EGPS, like portfolio, handbook, reflective journal, or not really, because from my experience, placement potential is hardly used in modern university. So a constructive force of doubt, instead of proper conclusions, what does fit for the market professional preparation training really mean? That leaves a room for a lot of flexible and adaptable solutions, and placement fits perfectly here. How to practically deal with inevitable technicization in the given educational settings. Placement uses the opportunity that the industry gives. So that's a great chance to combine the two. How to build educational didactic constants in the midst of a dispersed translation industry. That's a dilemma. Is placement of assistance in the transition from a general introduction to TS type of classes towards hand-on experiential and self-reflective learning that we do perform in our practical translation classes. Is placement neglect justified, or are we missing some potential to be activated? My postulate is that there is some unexplored potential here. And I think I would be for turning it from a merely curricular formal requirement into a fertile ground for developing professional skills and behavior. Thank you very much.
Just to the point, 20 minutes. Thank you very much. I hope you have a lot of comments, questions. We have
some food for thought, hopefully from the handout, so I'm available whenever during the conference.
Have some questions.
Yes, please. I have a suggestion. Professor Piotrowska, I'm really grateful for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
so much in connection with mine that I thought, when listening to that, it would be a good idea for us to listen to.
And then
what
have
I
questions.
can see and discuss it together.
Can we agree?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and then we can have more time for discussion.
No problem.
Yeah, because what I'm going to say, I think will just supplement a few of the ideas that we've just heard.
Fine. It is a very good suggestion. Thank you very much. So the floor is now to Professor Nijolė Maskaliūnienė from University of Vilnius.
Yeah. I am from Vilnius and I'm really happy to be here. I don't remember when well, we are in Warsaw quite frequently, but only at the airport. Because going to Brussels or going to other places, usually we take planes via Warsaw. So, and I've been to the city itself, I don't remember when, maybe 10 years ago. So it's a very nice coming back, and I'm very grateful for being in the conference. And getting back to the presentation, once again, I'm very grateful to Professor Piotrowska, because I was sitting and listening and thinking that I wouldn't be able to present it in such sophisticated terms, the ideas that I had to say.
Cauliflower.
Just simply because she, from what I hear, has researched the problem in detail, participated in the project for 3 years and so on. And what I am going to say is just a reflection of our everyday work, because I thought of this project, of this topic for the presentation, simply because of what you said at the beginning, that nobody speaks about it. And it's really a very important issue. Also, there is some mismatch of the term. I use the term internship. You use the term placement.
It's more to do with language variety, British English, because the project was based in London, Britain, so we used placement.
Yeah, well, I just thought when I was preparing, I was thinking whether to use internship or placement, because I know that they are used pretty much interchangeably. And my idea was that perhaps internships are a bit shorter, placements may be longer, but maybe not.
Internship, the other way around.
The other way around? Okay, maybe. Whatever. I also decided to speak on internships because they are an integral part of our studies, and I also agree with the professor that they should be. So, and even the plan is so much similar, but believe me, I didn't read a single text. I mean, there are a book like Nijolė or whatever, but just the ideas came up to me from what we do every day. Yeah. So a few words about different approaches to translation internships, the way I see that, the benefits of translation internships as an integral part of the studies, just a few ideas from our experience, what we do, the value of the feedback of internships I have in mind, and the problems we face. I would like to conclude by again discussing almost the same problematic aspect, how to combine reality and expectations. That's why my topic is on the content, on the problems, and on the expectations as a conclusion. What to do? Yeah. Now, different approaches to translation internships. You know, in Lithuania, I am not quite sure about other countries, but I know some in which the situation is the same. There is a legal requirement to have an internship at a BA level. In BA programs, you must have internships, in all programs. But there is no such requirement at an MA level. So and imagine translation. For very many years, our department only ran a course on MA translation program. And only later on, when we saw how many programs kind of recruited students from the pool that they prepared themselves in a BA program, we introduced BA in translation. So our MA programs in translation and in interpreting are much older. They are 20 years old. We started them 20 years ago, while BA is only 8 years. Yeah? But with BA, it's obligatory. With MA, no say. If you want, you may have it. If you don't, you don't. But we want to be in the EMT. And in the EMT, there is a requirement that the program has to have the placement or internship component. And from what I hear among the colleagues who come for EMT meetings and during their discussions, very many programs have this problem, especially those which are run only for 1 year. Yeah? For instance, in Britain or Ireland, they try to invent all kinds of ways where to include this placement because the course is very short. Okay, so the discussions are going on, and when I started talking about introducing those placements in our program some 7 maybe years ago, I heard very many different opinions, which I summed up in these few statements on the slide. That, well, of course, it would be good, it is important, and we will do it, or we are doing it. It's an integral part of our syllabus, that is of the syllabus. So, in certain, but this is not in Lithuania. Again, another statement is that internship is important, but our course is too short to incorporate it in the syllabus, like in Britain. They say, just when can we have this internship when the course is only 2 semesters? And I know one university at which they only study for 1 semester, and the second semester is placement. How nice? What do teachers do? If they study only for half a year, and in the end they get a diploma, they are translators. Yeah, and it's in London. Yeah. Another argument which was against our ideas to introduce internship at MA level was that why bother? Why bother if it's not required by law? There's so much work, so much organization, contacts with employers, just placement of all students in different places, then collecting their reports and so on. You all know how much work it involves. And if it's not required, why do you want to introduce it? Well, one of the incentives, of course, was EMT. Another is that we really realized the value of it. Now, and in the end, the last argument or statement was that we have so many practical courses. And some of my colleagues were of that opinion, that we have very many practical courses, and trainers from the market come in to give lectures and so on. Why send students to those places somewhere in the agencies or other places when actually we do it ourselves? It's the best practice that we can have, and so on. There was such an argument. So different approaches to translation interpretation. Some think that they are important and should be there. Others think that they are important, but we cannot have this luxury. Finally, why bother? It's hard work. And in the end, some think that what we have within the university is enough. The students were of a different opinion. Students thought that it was very good to have internships. It would be good for them to have this placement. And of course, when reading their reports when they get back, again, I have summarized the ideas of the benefits they see for the practical work and just practical access, hand-on access to the experience of the market. First of all, they have a chance to learn this craft of translation firsthand, because some of them, as I'm speaking about MA level, already work and do translations, but others do not. They do not know how to approach an employer to get some orders for translation. And again, some students say, okay, when I will start translating when I finish, when I graduate from the university. Well, actually, it's, in my opinion, it's a bit too late, because while you are studying, you can discuss with your teachers, you can discuss with your colleagues, and so on. You have more experience. Others are just too shy to approach the employer. But it's a chance for them to learn the craft. Then also, from our side, it's good to show them that everything they are learning is relevant, that they will need it when they graduate from the university. And our program is 2 years, 4 semesters. It's much longer than 1 year. So we can accommodate this internship. Now, then we all agree that to get a job is getting more and more difficult. Now, if there is such a competition, it's very good to have something to put on your CV, because you know the saying that we will not accept you without experience, and you cannot have experience because you did not have any job. So by doing internship, they already have a certain contact, and they can put something on their CV. And agencies are very happy with their students. For instance, last year, 4 students were employed right away. Actually, one didn't even come back from the internship. He only came up to defend his thesis, but he was working all the time. They employed him right away. So they are also looking for good students because they need good translators. Now, and of course, the benefit of being taught by somebody working there is also evident, because sometimes if I say that it's not correct, it's not good to say like this, you should do it like this, sometimes they don't believe. Yeah. But when their just partner or colleague at the agency says the same, they say, oh, she was right, I should do this like this. So it's much better to see and learn, to see how they do and learn from somebody more experienced. And also they see that those who think to start translating only after they graduate from the university are kind of mistaken, because it's a different thing to have practical task and a task which you do at home, you translate, but then you discuss every sentence, every aspect of the text with the teacher, and if you didn't know something you may omit, nothing happens and nobody suffers. And here it's already responsibility, because you are working for a client. So, and then in the end, I think no simulation, because we hear about them quite a lot in the discussions of EMT programs in Brussels. No simulation of the job market is not the job market. Still, they know that it's a simulation. And the different thing is when they are in the agency and when they have to call a client, or even if they have to make a cup of tea for some important client when he comes to talk to boss or whatever, and they hear the discussion and negotiations and so on, and the importance of deadlines and customer service and so on. They can learn that only when they do their internships. So actually, there's no need for us all to be convinced of its practical use. Of course, it's useful, yeah, but and therefore, we decided to include internships as an integral part of the studies. And we have 2 months of practical work. And the tasks consist of the following that you see on the slide. First of all, they are given a set of lectures, and at the beginning I was surprised, now I am used to that people running big companies, working in agencies, and in general, people from the market are very willing to give those lectures. Not a single lecture is given by a university professor. There are 12 lectures all in all, and they are all given by the people from the market. And if, for instance, I say that, well, this or that person gave us the lecture in February, at the beginning of the internship, the lady asked me, why didn't you call me? She's kind of surprised or insulted or so on. Well, but I cannot call each. I said, okay, if you want, if you can suggest a topic, you are most welcome. And we agreed that she will give a lecture on translating for the EU institutions because they won the tender to translate for them. Then of course, these lectures are combined with their work at the agency. We agreed with their employers who employ them for those 2 months that they will be allowed to attend the lectures. So we just work out the timeline of the lectures and they come. Then there is, of course, a discussion with the students and the analysis of the reports that you referred to. But I also agree that not all the benefits are taken from it because there are lots of reports, and here we come up to a few problems. I would like, here is the data, I will speak about the problems first. If we have a minute, I can mention that. The problems relate with every aspect of those internships. First of all, again, we often hear how long this internship should be. When a representative of the market, let's say like from some association of translators starts speaking, and Malgorzata can support me in this. We hear them often. They are invited almost to every meeting in Brussels. They say that the length of this placement or internship should be from 3 to 6 months. Well, we cannot afford that. But otherwise, they say we have no time for them. Well, in 3-6 months, it's fine. Then, so again, how long, how short it should be. In the reports that are given to the assessors of the EMT, I noticed that in some schools there are only 2 weeks, and it can be up to 2 months. And 2 months, it's kind of seems reasonable. Then, of course, it depends on the number of students you have. We have 24 students in the program. And sometimes it's pretty difficult to find remember, Lithuania is not Poland. It's not 40 million people. Yeah, it's pretty difficult even to place each of these 24 students to have a place, proper place. Then some agencies take advantage of the students. Yeah, they give too much work for the students and treat them as free labor force, and well, we come across such situations as well. Now, it's really a problem that the access to students' places is limited. We joined ULITA, we joined another association in Europe, and we see that only students with big languages are hired. And we did that, and we paid that participants fee only because we expected internships. But now we get some through Erasmus. But again, not many. Then what I see really as a problem, almost all employers give their evaluation as 10. The top evaluation. Nonsense. They are just started learning. But why not let them have it and so on? So then there is no differentiation. Of course they do very differently, but they evaluate them very, very well. So as Malgorzata is showing the time, I have to wind up, and I skipped a few passages about the content, the questions for discussion. So what is that ideal duration of the internship? Where to direct students to do their internship? What load of work can be expected? How can we weigh? How can we evaluate? Because, well, we are an academic institution. They have to get their evaluation. I imagine that these are the questions that all of us face. Reality is one thing. The high expectations on both sides from the market and from the students is another. Thank you for your attention, and we can start a discussion.
Maybe I would ask Professor Piotrowska to join. We have 10 minutes for discussion, so please do not hesitate. I will do just one comment, general comment. Today in the morning I talked about this first school of translators and interpreters in Poland, and already in '63 there was placement for 1 month for every student. So it was quite a long idea. It is quite a long and old idea. So please. Yes.
Okay, maybe not quite a question, but more of an aside. I think we need to remember that whatever we call it, be it placement or internship, that's only a starting point, like a springboard for further discussions, debates, feedback sessions, and so on. And I think quite often it so happens that students participate in an internship or in a placement program, and then there's too little time left for what's really to come later. And they either fail to reflect properly on it, or reflections never made part of the internship experience. And I've had this experience in English language teaching, where students also go to schools and they do what's called teaching practice, but then they are, for example, evaluated in a way which clearly demonstrates that although some of them underperformed at school, they were evaluated quite positively by the teachers there, right? Or by the teachers who never see them in action, but just relied on the documents provided, for example. And I think there's really a need to devote a lot more attention to feedback, reflection, because if it's not reflection driven, then I think what they take away from the internships is simply too little. It's just, it'll all be, their experience will be all limited to their assumptions, sometimes false assumptions, their impressions, but not genuinely what they should really be about. Okay, so I think we should go in that direction to a much larger extent.
Just one word. We try to address it because they are supposed to submit their reports. And reports are written also by the employers. So it's also very burdensome if you have to convince them, you ask them, just please evaluate our students. But the students have to write quite an extensive report. They have to present the text that they had, they have to show their problems, and then we meet to discuss that. But I agree with you, because it is in the last semester, and they are busy with their final papers. So I don't know if they hear me well. Yeah,
and if I may respond, I think I would even venture a more general comment on that. On the basis of the project, we've noticed that in self-reflection, Polish students are weaker because they are less willing to self-reflect in general. And let's say students at Mainz University gave more extended reports. So it goes alongside, general educational experience. This, I would stereotypically call it Polish reluctance to ask questions, because it is a certain educational framework that we have been used to. And it's changing now, but still self-reflection, in order to be productive, needs a little bit of awareness training and getting used to. So to turn placement experience from a mere requirement that you just tick off and it's done, and to convince students that it's worthwhile to self-reflect, it's a whole new school of thought.
If I may add just a small comment, I think a placement or an internship is very important also to acquire the sort of ethic of the profession.
Yeah.
The ethic, how to behave in a professional way and in a professional place.
And that's the whole argument against one of the items specified in my colleague's presentation, that some of the university teachers claimed that students get the same experience in class because they are taught by experts. I totally disagree with it.
Yeah, well, this is just one of the statements that were given. That's right.
Because work ethics would not be there at all.
Of course, of course.
I know you have a question.
Yeah, just a simple practical question. Do you have any information, data or statistics saying where students actually find their placement? Are these translation agencies or are they institutions?
We don't have statistics, however, we keep documentation because all agreements signed with the placement provider are kept in the institution. And I would say it's a mix. It's just my observation. No hard data are available, but it's a mix of translation agencies and institutions that take students on placement. It's very, very diverse. Each year, and it has a tendency of change. So some periods are more like big companies placement oriented, and sometimes we have more students on placement with small translation agencies. And we've organized with the Jagiellonian University and Pedagogical University, we organized a series of so-called career days, meetings between placement providers, university units training translators, and we had several debates on the issue of how placement can be made more productive. So it seems to be something that does not attract attention too much, although it might be worthwhile, and still a lot can be done.
I have a comment and a little bit of self-criticism actually, because I am an internship coordinator here at the institute. I've been the coordinator for a year now, and I can already see some things in the system that could be improved.
Yeah, exactly. The system.
And what you mentioned is really critical, and that's the feedback you get from students. We don't have that element right now. We just collect their certificates of internship completion and no more information. And I think a lot of them would be willing to contribute. And I see that when I ask them questions about their internship. They are willing to contribute, they are willing to tell me what they didn't like, tell me what they liked, and I think if I find a more formalized way to collect that information, that might be a really revealing source of data. And a colleague of mine is already doing it for teaching apprenticeships. And what she receives are essays, pages and pages of self-reflection and feedback on how the cooperation with the school and the teacher, on how it was and how it worked. And I think the same could be done for translation internships. So we are focusing on the first phase, which is preparing the students, getting them ready for the different places where they can end up. But we're not, at least I can say I'm not good enough at collecting the feedback in a more formalized way that can be published and that can feed back into the cycle of training students.
And to be absolutely clear, of course I'm not criticizing any parties involved in the educational system now, because I fully realize what the systemic conditions, at least in Poland, are. So it's obvious that we can't do what is not feasible within the number of hours, time limits, etc., etc. And because of my pragmatics inclination, I would keep things sensible. So perhaps manageable amount of feedback can be received and can be manipulated and can be analyzed in some ways. So depending on the purposes of implementation of whatever we may get as feedback, because placement coordinator is one function. The data that we can receive thanks to placement can also be used towards or by other researchers. So there is a range of possibilities. Like we, in some curricula, some programs offer flexibility because there are, I don't know, options or some specialization modules that are flexible and maybe adapted to
The programs
not
are
just
totally
rigid
different.
modules.
We have so many teaching hours in our programs that sometimes it is not possible to have 6 months of placement.
6 months of course, 6 months of course is not possible. I could add one comment that it takes time. It takes time. At the beginning, well, it used to be traditional in many placements, it still are at our university, that students are encouraged to find the places themselves and nobody cares what they do, and then they bring in the certificate signed with excellent results, and that's it. So somehow initially, although we offered a number of places for them, but they also had this idea, and they said, okay, I'm going there, I will do there. They have some friends, some relatives of somebody, and they go somewhere. But 1 year, another year, when they saw what those who who really had a place to work, those whom we sent, because those who did not say that they had a place were all distributed by us. We agreed with the employers, and so then we know what they are doing, we can discuss, we can follow what they are doing. I can just drop by and see. And then the reports are also getting more and more extensive with years. And in the report, we structured the report in such a way that they are forced to answer certain questions. And one of the questions is, for instance, what competences you missed. They have to reflect what, and you would suggest that we could include something in our program for future students. Another question is about themselves, what they think that they haven't learned that we taught and that they didn't take from us. So you can structure those questions, but it takes time. And now, every year, more and more students ask for us to find them a place or just to do something.
So, thank you both
Thank you.
of you. Thank you very much. And now I would ask Professor Konrad Klimkowski from the Catholic University of Lublin to take the floor.
I need some. Should I use this?
Yes.
Can I use it?
Yes. So the title of this lecture is Translation as a Service, Ideas for Translator Education and Self-Education.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks very much for organizing the event. I think it's a wonderful event, and my regrets are just I cannot be at some other presentations because they are lovely. I think, is this okay? I think it's a tradition now. You were sitting. Okay, in a way, to keep a link between what have been said and my presentation is let's move from a macro scale to a micro scale. In other words, placement and how to put an interface, as I call it, between a curriculum in the formal sense and somehow agreeing it with the market, with industry and other stakeholders. Now, I would like to focus on the notion of a service, but from a more reflexive, a little bit of an individual point of view. In what sense? I'll try to show you that in a sec. So, very briefly, a theoretical outline, but that's too much to say, just in a very sketchy way, some ideas to start with. Translation service, those ideas I would like to show why it is worthwhile to introduce this notion as an element of a classroom and also extra classroom, there is no such a word, but sounds nice, context. And then translation service, educational implications, theoretical outline, and perhaps the two positions on the list, which are not the only ones, but I think they changed a little the discourse before these two. Because I believe these two positions said, more or less, all right, even at the beginning of the talk about translation competence, early German researchers, Wüls, Koller, they automatically assume that translation competence is professional competence. Still, does it mean we do something with this, particularly this kind of competence at school, at high school, at university? Perhaps not. And of course, there were also positions like Bell, Robinson, Samuels, and Brown, self-development, how to become a translator, okay, developing your own skills. But Guadec and EMT said it's an obligation of an educational system to include elements of pro-business or professional development. This is more or less the point I would like to make. Of course, the list is much, much longer, especially from 2007 and later. And there is one reason why I would like to, again, revoke or refer again to EMT 2000. Of course, this is this central element here. Translation service provision. These authors decided this is a central element for them. Yeah, okay, if it's a model, if it's reductionist, let's leave it alone. There is a lot of criticism about this model, and some of it is absolutely, I at least subscribe to a lot of critical remarks. Still, they profiled a particular way of thinking that sooner or later, the perspective they decided to take is how to deliver services on something called the market. And this is more or less the list of one of the dimensions, the interpersonal dimension. If you know the model, I hope you at least some elements are known to you. And this perhaps resembles the list from the handout given by Professor Piotrowska though there were also those executive elements or working elements listed there. But it's more or less the same, okay? Some questions and answers about what to do. What does it mean to be a good, professional translator? Now the question is, okay, let's imagine that you don't have a special component for entrepreneurial skills. You would like to have something of that kind as part of your class, okay? Maybe not having a lot of time to devote to developing business plans and so on and so forth, okay? Or even if you have them, they may be a little bit more general, like run by some representatives of economy department, as this is the case at our university. Now, I would like something more market specific. How to translate this list? Because, of course, you may lecture. Yes, this is an obvious option, right? Yes, you have, no, you don't. Yes, you have, no, you don't. But does it make sense? No. So one way is maybe if we take some elements, some concepts out of this long list and try to somehow, surprisingly enough, talk with students about it without lecturing. And one example, you may understand service in at least two ways. One, perhaps resembling more of a sales, right? Just you come, you give a commission, you are paid. Linear, just a purely linear, repeated linear structure. Now, it may also look like this. Because when you would like your customer to be a repeat customer, as Americans say, or you would like to retain your clients, then the story becomes somewhat different. What's the difference between these two? Oh yeah, it works. This one, that is to say, a relationship. Something starts, it's no longer the linear relation between you and the job, but also the client. You start thinking about some strategies to make her come back, okay? And this is what you plan. You start planning circularity, because of course, especially when you're a freelancer, you don't care much about one instance. You care much about planning ahead, okay? What's the difference between what I would like to call linear view and circular view? Single act versus repetitive act, and a kind of relationship. Product-oriented, you just sell, okay, I mean, fine, done, you don't care. If you have doubts, you may ask. If you don't, oh, well, all right, he will not come again, he, she. Not a perfect quality management solution, but after all, if you can't, sometimes you may even try to ask your clients, but they refuse to answer, or they are not cooperative. Now, if you decide you would like a little bit more strategic relationship with your client, you definitely invest more into what's going on between commissions, between orders, communication, and then quality is not just a matter of my skills, my being responsible, my being timely, and that's it. No discussion. It becomes a relational matter. What to do next time, how to improve, how not to go too far, because we had also this very nice story called proactivity. But proactivity works both ways. There may be too much proactivity, which makes our client lazy and actually accepting errors they make, because we are ready to react in time. So it always, it's always a question of negotiating quality. Quality becomes a process, not just a result of a particular job. And then what is crucial, okay, effective communication is always an asset. I know, not very, a truism. However, in the circular view, it's a critical tool. If you lose communication, if you cannot communicate effectively with your client, you're done. There will be problems. Okay, so maybe to be a little bit, okay, so in other words, what I think is that this relational view on translation service and translation service quality is that this pre-translation, translation, and post-translation is as Guadek has it in his number of processes that we take, okay? What I think is that the linear view mostly covers the responsibility of a translator, whereas the relational view or circular view looks further, looks for what happens before we get the order and what happens later on. because we would like to have something later on. Now, maybe to be a little bit more practical, so coming to those potential activities I would like you to consider just as for your classroom space. Imagine a situation that made a translator write the following email to her client. Dear John, I'm afraid I need to inform you that the text I've been sent from your office is largely incomplete. I've sent 3 emails, got no response. I'm afraid the deadline we established on Monday is unrealistic and it's impossible for me. Could you please send me the correct version of the file? Okay, and you may ask your students to somehow react to this piece. How do you feel about this situation? How would you construct the scene that must have been going on to make a translator write a thing of that kind? Is everything polite here? Is everything impolite here? How to play with this text? What would you do about it? Would you send a similar email if you were in the translator's shoes? Do you understand her? Perhaps some of it is a little bit impolite, right? But I don't know. That's an open question. Let's do an activity. No, sorry, we have no time. And then question is, would you modify anything in that? So we would like to ask students, first of all, to visualize the situation and maybe then to modify if something is keeping it a little bit too far, or maybe not far enough. Is it that the first thing that it's the first case that the thing happens, or maybe it's a repetitive fault of our client? Okay, and then the question is, how am I to play with my responsibility for being part of her business? Because I do have it, but now if it's the 3rd time and nothing changes after my 3rd mail, maybe I should give up. So a lot of scenarios you can draw, you can picture, you can make about it. Of course, you can imagine that may be just an open discussion, but you can also imagine that students, you may ask students to write their own answers or their own versions. For instance, you establish some scenarios, potential scenarios, and they react with their own emails, keeping things they find valuable, changing those that they believe they need to change. If I may recommend some points to browse through this text, is that I believe there are at least 4 basic elements that you can play with, talk about, because obviously such activities are never yes/no. There are good answers, bad answers. There may be different positions, different conditions. I believe this exercise shows how to define our axiologies. I know it's a very elevated concept, but it is a business concept. It's what we believe are business values, where we find reasons for actions. What are our teleologies? What are our objectives? Do I want to keep this customer and I need him very strong because he is my strategy, or I try another time but then I give up, okay? Cultural context, what is polite, what is impolite, should I do this, maybe there are some other pathways I should use before becoming angry, and so on. Business context, again, as I said, proactivity, fine, but how far? Am I fully responsible for my client's business, or am I just a part of it and I should play with my responsibility to a reasonable degree? Of course, deadline management, this is obvious, and we may say that there is some mention of the question of relation between deadline and quality, okay, and trying to react proactively, preemptively, trying to react to a potential problem. But the last thing, if I may make you a little bit biased about this text, the last thing which and the reason why I use this text among others in my class is that, is this text solution-oriented? I believe it's not. What I believe in a general narrative, the client gets this. Well, you have a problem, I have a problem, but because of my problem, you have a problem, and in fact, you have a problem. Would I like my client to hear that? No. So maybe there is some other way to reconstruct this, to avoid this meta-narrative of problem. Activity number 2. Imagine a new client is just about to call you. What questions should you be ready to ask your client? What answers should you be ready to give to the client? You know what I mean? The situation where students realize that what are those elements defining my relationship to potential client who is likely to call? Of course, as we know from previous presentations, students are very likely to think about 2 things: price, time. And they are right in thinking about that. The problem is, this activity is about showing them that these 2 simple categories are far more complex. In fact, you need to have a strategy before you are ready to answer a simple call. Because it's about pricing strategies. Are you ready for, do you have a discount policy? Or maybe you decide to avoid discount policy. There are 2 options and 2 voices in the literature I can see. Are you actually ready? Is your knowledge about prices is, my colleague takes this, so I will also take this? Or is it based on my own profit-loss calculation, you know, kind of at least preliminary accountancy, okay, of my company I plan to run? And of course, the decision is whom I plan to be my client. Is it just one go, or is it a repeat kind of client or customer? Again, time. When students think about time, the first idea is, we calculate pages, so I need this. What about proofreading? What about potential consultations, post-consultations, or any kind of post-translation processes? Do I think about asking my client or customer for resources, knowledge resources, for improving my knowledge about her projects? And of course, there is nothing about reading the text before. No students of mine asks to, first of all, I would need to see the text. No way, I mean, price and time. How many pages? Okay, no, right, so that's the problem, that exactly this simple exercise, I keep repeating it and adding those elements. Okay, so again, you need to get the answer for that to be able to ask and be able to answer the question. Okay, so just 2 simple activities to introduce, you know, they may take longer to realize, they may be short, okay, they may be short discussions, but I use them as part of my classes. I don't have a separate component for becoming a translator, but from time to time, between, you know, just kind of fillers, but sometimes also with additional jobs. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your discipline. It was 20 minutes.
Yeah, it
sharp.
was.
So, do you have questions, suggestions, critics? Yes, please.
Thank you. A kind of comment. I think thank you, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation and the information you relayed to us in the course of it. I think your presentation nicely illustrates that sometimes relatively little data is so useful to us as translator educators in that we can process that information constantly and look at it from different angles and each time take something new out of that. And even a short email, which you presented at the beginning as part of the first activity, may be so much food for thought when it comes to educating students and drawing their attention to what they really need to concentrate on while collaborating with a client, right? And there's so much room here for education, for translator education.
You know, my strange kind of observation is that because we as translators and translator educators work in the field of communication, we take communication a little for granted. Big communicative act, fine. But what happens in the classroom? The same goes with assessment. Assessment is not something separate from learning. It's part of our communicative practice in the classroom. If you say, that's fine to your students when answering a question, that's a communicative assessment act. Use it. It has huge potential to build further on. So exactly, my reaction to Kirali's model, because obviously I also work or try to develop along these lines, is to use small things. I know that Don, especially in 2000, he had those aspirations of building a little bit of a system, which is actually his idea is more about anti-systemic. However, he still had some pretenses. Yeah.
He doesn't.
Who doesn't? Now, what I'm trying to do is to use his ideas from micro perspective. A minimal, so I'm reducing the educational system, układ dydaktyczny, right, to a minimal size, because I believe there are some atomic reactions that may expand it later on or further on, and it's good to have them expanded. But those things that happen between the teacher and the student are crucial. Okay.
Any other question? If not, I have one question. May I? So, it is an observation, quite provocative, I should say. I have just read a book by Kaisa Koskinen about user-oriented translation. And don't you think that in this EMT model, we all love models, there is something missing in this service provider part of the model? We think about the client, the direct client, but we forget about the user, which is from the Scopus theory, isn't it? It's very, very complicated. It is one step further. It is one step further.
You're absolutely right. You know, I think it is, on the one hand, I'm not happy in being a position of a defender of the EMT model. Not that I completely disagree with it, but you are right.
We are a member of the EMT, so I won't criticize it either.
No, you are right. I mean, obviously this model has a particular perspective. Certain things disappear from it. That's true. Of course, the model maybe also, because of its belonging to European institutional context, uses the notion of stakeholders. And I believe those users are there. But you're absolutely right. I would also agree, because if I'm to talk about relational things in translation, you're absolutely right. This service differs from a lot of other services which are also relational, but there are no two players involved, translator and the author and the user. You are right. You are right. Because if you have internet service provider and the client, they may be in a relationship. That's true, because they may use this internet or software provision for a number of reasons. They may be in need of developing and so on. But there is no third person of a user. You're absolutely right about that. I think it got reduced there, somehow taken for granted. Yeah, I agree.
So, if there is no more question, perhaps no question. Yes,
just one more word. If we think that we can treat this language service provision very broadly, and we approach it rightly as teachers, and we have our axiologies which take the user into account, I think we can quite easily incorporate that element into the EMT model too. So I don't think we have to take it for granted that the model by definition excludes the user.
No.
I think we can bring the user in, but it's, as you emphasized in your presentation, it's really important that we realize what axiologies we wish to follow in our teaching calls. Right?
No, I don't think the point was that it excluded, but it's a little bit ignored.
It might it might not be perhaps brought up enough. But I think we can do it.
Yes, we do. As far as I remember, all those like Professor Gładek, Professor Tabakowska, they repeat very frequently, it's an invitation, it's a starting point. It's not. This is why it's not a model in a positivist sense. It's either a conception and a certain visualization, certain, drawing certain trajectory of how to think about. Yes, certain systematic, but again, of course, those questions: what goes where and why not there? Yeah, okay. This is why it
is
cannot.
open.
It's
It is
open. And if you try to read it in a close-ended way, you are in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very
Thank
much.
you very
once
much.
more.
Thank you.
Now I would like to ask Dr. Piotr Szymczak to take the floor and to present our last talk, how not to lose friends or alienate people, creating authentic student translation project that work.
It's going to be a tough
Very,
ride.
very ambitious.
Yep, but at least if you alienate anyone or lose friends, you know you have only yourself to blame. Sorry, let me just find this. There we are. Okay, so we've spent some time talking about work placement, and I think this is a telling fact that we'd always recognized that authentic work done for real users in the real world is a sort of gold standard in translator training. We realized that even before we were able to come up with effective placement strategies or sophisticated theoretical reflection on the fact. And today, I want to talk about an aspect of using authentic work in translator training without having to find recourse to these sorts of official institutional placements. So in a way, I will be soaring away at the branch that many people are sitting on, apparently. I've made an effort to make myself findable online, so I will be talking about some of the projects I've done, but obviously for reasons of time and space, we'll be very brief here. So if you want to test drive any of the things I'll be talking about, you can go to my website and see how those things work. I think the first thing to say about this, and there are several things that we need to say before we can start talking about these experiences, is that it's an odd fact about our educational system that, unlike in the olden days, where people would start their apprenticeship and they would do something useful on the first day at the age of maybe 6 or 7, today it takes something like a quarter of a century before you are led anywhere near real responsibilities. And obviously this realization is behind this school of thought that we've been referencing a lot, social constructivism, and more broadly the entire constellation of different approaches, person-centered pedagogies. Obviously, very briefly, this idea is that I'm feeling very uncomfortable because some of us have written entire books about the subject or organized like enormous research institutions around this problem. But if you don't know about social constructivism, the idea is that this is person-centered, meaning that learning is viewed as something that is embedded within social relationships. So one of those books that I referenced was by Professor Klimkowski. You can see this at great length, how these ideas have evolved and what sort of shape they have taken. You can also check out this consortium, which Professor Piotrowska is running, and this brings together people who work in this vein and in other schools of thought and approaches. So very briefly, just for reasons of clarity, the idea behind social constructivism, especially as applied to translator training, is that the view is not transmissionist. The instructor's role is not so much to tell you what you need to know, but rather to facilitate autonomous learning. So in other words, to make it possible for you to develop those skills in a way that is embedded within social interactions. So a metaphor that we often use is that of a scaffolding, so something, a temporary structure that you erect around a building, and then you remove it when it's no longer needed. In the same way, the instructor will assist, the learners will help the students achieve something they couldn't achieve unassisted, but then he or she removes him or herself. So as we mentioned, Donald Kirali was instrumental in introducing this particular approach to translation studies, and obviously this has evolved and changed enormously. So we are today talking about different models, more emergentist approaches and so on. But I think those old models also have much to recommend them, and I think it's a telling fact that we have all been talking about this EMT model, and much as we can criticize this, it's a telling fact that we all are referencing it. I will be using it later on, even though it may seem theoretically naive in some ways because it's so compartmentalized and so mechanical, as it were. It has this benefit of clarity and precision that you can use so long as you are aware of the limitations that it has. So, like I said, one problem that we face when we want to expose our students to these real-life environments is sourcing jobs, trying to find jobs. Placements are one way, but if you are not fortunate enough to have Tomasz working tirelessly behind the scenes to source jobs for you, like you do here at this fine institution, then if you're just working in a smaller institution or don't have that sort of hinterland organizationally, one thing you can rely on is this emergence of Web 2.0, or as we call it today, the internet. There was a time when the internet was organized more like television is today, in that there was a limited number of people who provided content and many content consumers. Today, everybody can easily become a content provider online, so this is what we used to call Web 2.0. And the second thing that sort of emerges out of this development in the online environments is crowdsourcing. So this practice of large numbers of people collaborating, pooling together the resources and the time and the cognitive surplus to create things like Wikipedia or TripAdvisor and so on and so forth, IMDb. And so I will be talking about authentic work in training and the different platforms that we have available today, very briefly and in not much detail. But at the same time, I will be wanting to map those different assignment formats onto this map of competence models. And that's because it illustrates that when we talk about authentic work in translator training, it seems like there's this one monolithic thing called authentic work. But I hope to demonstrate that within each of those types, there will be different competences to be fruitfully developed or explored. We talked about the shortcomings of the EMT model. Professor Treuk mentioned the fact that we don't really talk much about the end client. Another thing that we don't really talk much about is the well-being of the learner himself or herself. So we don't really know to what extent authentic work is effective per se when you are teaching students. I am not aware of any sound empirical, like with control groups and so on, studies that would tell you that it's actually better empirically, but we know qualitatively that our students tell us that work experience, first-hand experience is useful. And we also know about things like the PERMA model of well-being, which is a recent psychological development that tells us that people simply enjoy doing things that are meaningful and that give them a sense of achievement. So we don't know exactly how effective it is, and we do know that it has certain disadvantages, authentic work in translation classrooms. So let me maybe address some of those problems first. One is workload. So obviously you're going to spend some time preparing your students and then marking the papers and so on. So in this case, the solutions are trainee autonomy and external partners. I will talk about both later on, but you will want to encourage your students to choose their texts, to source their texts, or if you have external partners, you will be working hard to shift as much of the work onto your external partners as possible. Another problem is difficulty levels. That's the very idea of the scaffolding and the social constructivist approach, where translation is interesting in that it is a job that requires great skill, and it often takes a lifetime to become a really good translator. But at the same time, there's quite a lot of good work you can do when properly assisted. So it will be part of your job to gauge those difficulty levels. In this case, one thing you really want to do is spend a lot of time preparing your students and offering formative assessment. So in many of my early assignments, I don't even grade those. I just offer very detailed feedback to my students so that when they do their second or their third job, they are well prepared and they no longer have this fear of not really knowing what the standards are or what the terminology is. And also, by doing authentic work, you are asking your students to really stick their necks out and do something that might expose them potentially to great responsibility or liability. So obviously, this formative feedback will help. Trying to bake other sources of feedback from your external partners might help, and obviously sourcing jobs that may not necessarily kill people outright if you make a mistake. And one important level, we talked a little bit about the ethics of translation training and translation in general. This is something that you really need to reflect on when you are asking people to do real work for real end users. Are they not being taken advantage of? There's a distinction, well-known distinction in the literature between product-driven, cause-driven, and outsourcing-driven crowdsourcing, which is why are you actually asking these people to help you, and what is the motivation they have? Is it because they really believe in a product? Is it because they really believe in a cause? Or is it because you simply want to get the job done more quickly or more efficiently or more cheaply? If the last is the case, then you're in trouble. You shouldn't be doing this because there will be a strong backlash. We've seen that very recently in Poznan. There was an interesting real-life assignment for students that generated a lot of controversy. I will be writing an article all about it. In fact, it's an interesting paradox that when you are using money in this kind of situation, this can have a counter-effective impact on your work. It's a well-recognized paradox in ethical reflection that monetary transactions have certain limitations. We know that if you, say, pay people for blood donorship, you're going to end up getting less blood and lower quality blood than if you just ask people to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And in this case, similarly, it's better to get your students excited about a project and willing to really contribute than to try and bribe them with things like prestige or a line in their CV, because they will see right through your bullshit and they will just be very unhappy about it, which is what happened in Poznan. Okay. So like I said, I will discuss these specific solutions and formats that I've been using. There will be 5 of them, and I will be using this EMT model of translation competences. You will note that this is the old 2009 model. I haven't even used the updated 2017 model because it's even more fragmentary and even more curtailed, so I like the old model. And like I said, it has its limitations, but it also has the benefit of clarity. So let's stick to it for a minute. So one thing, and it's a well-known format, I think many people have used this, we have some people who have used this as well, is Wikipedia translation or Wikipedia development. So those people who have written about this have got students to translate little bits of Wikipedia into their own native language. That's one possibility. Or one other thing is that we often get this complaint that when you ask students to submit essays, you often end up with this sort of Frankenstein monster thing where people just take little bits out of different Wikipedia article, cobble it together, and give it to you as an essay. So what's stopping us from getting people to write essays that are not on Wikipedia and then asking them to publish those things on Wikipedia. So this is an approach that I took with my History of Translation Theory course, where students were encouraged to develop and improve and create, where necessary, new content on Wikipedia on translation studies. So they discussed certain one of the students is sitting here in the front row, and she did a brilliant job, Anna Jaworska. So if you go to Polish Wikipedia and find it unusually informative about translation studies, that is one reason. We've been doing this for a while now. And if you look at this from the point of view of the EMT model, you see that it's actually, it can be quite, you can fill quite a lot of that circle. The pink bit, thematic, is where thematic competence is when you get people to actually develop their own content rather than just do translations. So they can either translate in existing articles, or they can create new articles about translation studies. I think sometimes when I have this like Martin Luther King-like dream, I would think it would be amazing if we could get collaboration between different universities so that your students can look at my students' work and improve it or extend it. So that's one thing, one way we can use this. Another thing is find an external partner and partner in translating some sort of socially useful content. So in this case, this is Humanities for Health. This is a project that I'm running with Cochrane Collaboration. This is a non-profit medical advocacy organization that tries to make evidence-based medical information available to patients and medical professionals. So what they do is they do meta-analyses of medical research. They prepare summaries. They call these plain language summaries. And so if you need information about your condition or the best treatment, you can go to Cochrane and find reliable studies on what works best. And you can even find this in Polish if you're lucky, because my students have been translating those things. So again, you get like bona fide translation, but also all kinds of other competencies baked into this format. In this case, the students, here it is potentially life-threatening, I agree, because it's medical information. So you do get very detailed feedback first from me, and then from the medical professionals at Cochrane. So they look at those people's jobs again. Cochrane people also handle the submission and the sourcing aspects of it, so I really don't have to get involved beyond offering the detailed feedback, formative feedback. But if you want to get in touch with the Cochrane people and start this kind of project for your own students, there's also the option of your students getting access to Cochrane's CAT tools, so the technological aspect can be very much explored by your students as well, instead of getting it handled by somebody else. One other thing, and this is perhaps a bit old-fashioned, so this is my third project that I've been running for a while. It's old-fashioned because we have now moved away, quite far away, from this idea of the language competency as being somehow central to what we teach. Okay, we tend to focus on technology and other things, but this old-fashioned idea of just teaching good English to your students is perhaps not the hottest thing out there. But I try to bake this into my tuition as much as I can. And so one of the things that we've developed is we use this platform called Memrise. There's another one called Duolingo. Both are very effective because they use spaced repetition. So we've developed a crowdsourced English course with like natural vocabulary items and phrases. And this is something that my students contributed to on Google Drive. Then we got it together, created this course on Memrise. It's very gratifying because this has been around on Memrise for a while, and now more than 3,000 people have used this course. So that's really nice. From just a couple of semesters worth of work by maybe 50 people, you get something, a resource that many people have used. There's actually more, because there's a research methodology course on Memrise for translation studies that was designed by me, but this way I can get my students to drill all of those concepts and terms into their memory. Another one, and this one made me absurdly happy because I wasn't involved in it almost at all. This was just something that one of my translation students groups got together to do, is a legal English to Polish documents terminology course that is really very big, but they parceled out the work among themselves. There were maybe 20 of them. Everybody did a bit of the work. They supplied synthesized audio for this. So this English documents course is just living peacefully on Memrise. You can use it for free anywhere you like, and it's very good for things like sworn translation and so on. So in this case, not much in terms of translation is involved, but you do get a very strong technological component and the language component. The fourth one is literary translation. So, thank you. So we did a translation of a book, and we actually published it in paperback and marketed it. It was great fun. It can get very unwieldy when you do literary translation. I'm doing it with a fresh round of students, very time-consuming, not like many of the... You have to use out-of-copyright works, so typically the language isn't the easiest either, and so on. But it has some advantages, especially with the stronger students. And finally, just to wrap up, audiovisual translation, obviously you know that many platforms like TED Talks or YouTube will make it possible for your students to subtitle the videos. If it's TED, they will even provide people to oversee the translation process and to provide feedback, so that's also very useful. And just if you look at this as a closing statement, if you look at those 5 different projects, you see that all of those involve doing authentic work for students, but really no two, well, maybe two are alike, but no two are completely alike in all respects. And so you have a wide variety of tools to choose from if you want to supplement placements or if you want to inject a bit of authentic work into your classroom. Thank you.
I invite you to ask questions. Dr. Szymczak. Please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to see an overview of different types of projects. Could you please clarify the project with students recording certain natural expressions in English? Was it like a language course?
Yes, it's more like a vocabulary acquisition tool that you can use. Maybe I can boot up my computer very quickly and show it because, you know, it's worth 1,000 words. The way this works is the way people learn best is by spaced repetition, if it's memory work. So people need to forget items and then they come back after a while, and this is a powerful impulse for their brain to hold on to information because they forgot it and now suddenly it's useful. So if you do this kind of thing, I'm going to find it in a second. Memrise is a platform that you can have on your smartphone or online, and it will do all of the recycling of vocabulary for you. So if you make a mistake in trying to remember a phrase, it will know to ask you sooner rather than later to recall this. If you're doing well, it will say, well, maybe in a week. Or if you're Łucja, maybe in a year. You know, she doesn't forget. And so this way you end up with courses that are available for free, and you can create them easily. So you can contribute new content and get people to do this. So this is the course, okay? And it has hundreds of different vocabulary items. You can see... Sorry. No, it's not this one. So maybe let me and begin it, okay? So these are the different things, and they are available as just regular electronic flashcards. So the way this works is, make it a bit smaller now. So the way this works is you simply say, I want to learn these phrases, okay? Learn, and then it's going to say things like this, okay? Heel is a command that you issue to a dog. And so you can use the speech synthesizer. I don't know if it's going to work here, but no, it's not.
Heel.
Okay, so it's going to tell you how to pronounce this, and then stay, and so on. And now you have to find the correct thing, okay? So donogi is heel. It's a bit laborious this way, if you do it on your desktop, but it's very intuitive and very handy and very quick on your smartphone. So if you're sitting on a tram, you can just quickly do your vocabulary for the day. Mariusz.
Okay, I have another question, because as you know, I involve my students in quite similar projects, maybe not such a broad range of projects that some of them do overlap and are quite close to what you've been involved in. But I have a question about, in fact it pertains to the title of your presentation, because it says creating authentic student translation projects that work. So my interest would be in ways in which you try to estimate to what degree they do work and to what degree they do not. And what are the tools? Because my interest, when I run projects with my students, I'm also very much interested in whether they actually work and what kind of evidence I can collect to really support whatever the verdict is, rather being positive or negative. So that's very much.
So I think the beauty of the idea of things working is that you can really decide in what way you care about these things working. So for us as instructors, the obvious first thing to consider is, are the students learning? But before we answer this question, I would say it's also important to see what sort of content are we creating. So one of the articles I'm working on, and one of the empirical explorations of this problem, is that, so we've got maybe 30 different articles on Wikipedia related to translation theory that were created by my students. So the question is, has anyone even used this sort of knowledge? Is it even useful for us to expend all this effort? So I've gone on Wikipedia and looked at the usage statistics, and there's like reliably every day somebody's gonna come and read this because they need to know about Werner Kohler or somebody like that. So over time, there's again 300 people, sometimes more, depending on the sort of like how hot the topic is. If you have someone about John Florio, then maybe it's once every 3 days. But if it's Barańczak, then everyday people. And this is also interesting. Perhaps I'm sidetracking this conversation a bit, but I'm also a member of a Polish Literary Translators Association, and one of the laments that you always keep hearing is, oh, we have no visibility, we have no stature, what can we do? Well, if you go on Wikipedia and you look at Stanisław Barańczak's page, it barely mentions the fact that he was a translator. Okay, he was the prince of translators from our point of view, but on Wikipedia he was mainly, an academic and a poet, and maybe a translator. So one of the tasks that my students were given was make sure that no one who comes to Barańczak's page will leave not knowing that he was a translator. So in this sense, I think there's plenty of potential for advocacy, for good, reliable information like this Cochrane project. We know there's a lot of controversy today with vaccines and so on. In terms of is it really helping our students to become better translators? Here, I think, personally, where I see the value is this very detailed, formative feedback. But that's something that's been taken care of elsewhere in the literature, where you know how to teach to get results.
Thank you.
Yes, please, if I may. I'm interested in two factors from the point of view of a pedagogue. Time factor in organizing projects, and student motivation, how to motivate and involve students who are perhaps less active by nature, or I don't know.
I think
Less motivated.
Well, I said you should address the better angel of people's nature, but that's not strictly true, because you also wield this power of giving credit for the course. So I just make it a course credit requirement to submit, say, 3 jobs. And then they just have to do it as a matter of course. But you just tell them, you know, either you can do something that you don't want to do, I don't want to read, and nobody will ever look at it again, or we can do something that's going to be used by others. And as a rule, they get excited, or at least they pretend to be.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Small. Thank all the speakers, and now I think we have deserved a coffee break. So.